All right, greetings, Cyber Patriots. Here we are working through our Cisco content some more. So this is chapter 2 in the content, but it's actually the 6th module from a Cyber Patriot, from a Cyber Patriot standpoint. Really, really good content. Go over this one. Try to understand everything you can. Note it. There are double advantages here. One is it touches on a lot of really good security content, not even just network security, but some really good security content to help us as security practitioners. But additionally, there's just really good network baselining here. So it doesn't worry too much about preceding content, not too much dependency. And again, just really good content, really helpful. So we're going to go through this terrific module. It's going to start out with some of its application view of things, which is fine. So we're going to skip through that a little bit. It goes through the switch boot sequence, not that different from really a PC. Some familiar acronyms. We talk about the POST, the power on self-test. You're probably used to seeing that in your computer. Programs stored in ROM, read-only memory. We've dealt with read-only memory back during our computer orientation phase of the program. So this is really just computer stuff, not necessarily Cisco or network specific. Checks the CPU subsystem. Same old thing with computers. Checks out the CPU, the memory, the flash devices, and all that. The bootloader software in the second step here. Again, this is really just a switch acting like a specialized computer, which I guess in some ways they are. Leverages a thing called the bootloader, small program that's in ROM, runs immediately after the post, successfully checks out the hardware and says everything's healthy. Begins a CPU initiation. There are little tiny memory holding chunks within the CPU, little memory holders called registers. Checks all that out, but again, just making sure the whole system's healthy before it gets any further. And then it loads the operating system. Of course, it's called iOS, which we're used to. Of course, we've been working in Microsoft Windows, been working in Linux, specifically Ubuntu, dealing with the Cisco networking gear. It's got an operating system also called the iOS. So it loads the operating system. Again, not really different from what a computer does. Finds the image, same idea, especially if you consider it from the VMware parallel. It finds the image, loads the image, starts booting up using what's there. So it's really just following almost like a computer's boot sequence. Now we get through a couple of things. We're just looking at some stuff, looking in the NVRAM, but startup config, so that's a file that gets things going on the Cisco side. That is network or Cisco specific. And we see the boot system and a couple other pieces that are just part of the boot sequence. So this stuff, good to get the idea. For the most part, you don't need to worry about this because typically it just works when it boots up and it's fine. Only if there's an error in your boot sequence do you usually need to get too in-depth on this, but it's good to understand it. Okay, a system crash. So they're going to talk about some of the things you do. I don't think we're going to see too much on this. Good to have an overview here. But they're giving you, take your PC, plug in the console cable, use this mode button bit to see if you can get to, I don't want to call it like a help mode or whatever, but using that to get to the switch before it gets to all the other boot sequence stuff, and see if you can get what's happened. Has a system gotten corrupted maybe on a file, or is there a hardware specific problem, what have you? Again, generally shouldn't see this stuff. Cisco gear is quite reliable. Not too often you just have to dig this deep unless you're on the network engineering side of the equation here. Goes through some LED indicators. This is good to know. You'll have all these on one of your switches. It shows a blow-up view here. All that's good stuff to get familiar with, but again, not something that have excruciating detail. Basic switch management. So they're going to show you, here's the PC and it's hooked up by a console cable to the switch. So in this instance, we're taking our computer and we're actually plugging a cable from the back or the side, depending on of the computer itself, physically to the switch. That's the first step you need to do. Get it configured so that it's available on the network. Then once you get the switch to a point where it's available on the network, you can do your management from PC over the network, not having to be physically proximate to it. But that's pretty typical of these devices. You plug in initially directly, get it going, and then you manage it from the network thereafter. They mentioned that, of course, to get it connected on the network, it needs an IP address, and you got to mention a subnet mask. And of course, you need to put in the router address in here because you need those basic three things to make it viable from an IP standpoint. You'll see it use the term default gateway. That's really the IP address of the router, that if it has to go from this LAN to another LAN. Well, how does it get there? It's got to ask a router how to do it. So you get with those three things. That's, again, that's basic PC networking stuff, not necessarily specific to Cisco or networking devices. Configuring a management interface. So they're going to go through these. We'll deal with this more in depth when we get to past round one and start looking at some of the Cisco stuff and spending more of our time on that. This is getting a management interface ready so that we can manage the device over the network as opposed to having to physically plug in with a console cable. Basic switch configuration lab. Be great when we get to that. We're going to have some fun with it. Okay, this is great stuff. Duplex communication. Simple idea. Two devices on the network. One where they're showing the full duplex communication. Another one showing half duplex. And notice that they've got arrows going both directions between the two devices. So they can send and receive simultaneously. So the device on the left is sending to the device on the right, and the one on the right to the one on the left, and it's happening the same time. And it works fine. Full duplex. Half duplex, this device is sending to the other one. It waits before it tries to send back to the device on the left. If it doesn't wait and tries to send at the same time, while the other one was already in a send, you get what's known as a collision. Traffic doesn't work from either side, it has to do it to retransmit. You get into these kind of collision situations on a switch, and it can really be crippling for your network environment. And there's some particular troubleshooting, well, trouble creating you can get into with this stuff, and then there's troubleshooting you do to deal with it. Most gear these days should be able to run full duplex just fine. Where you get into trouble is when the devices do things to themselves to get into something other than full duplex or the wrong speed setting and cause you trouble, not because you did anything, but because they automatically put themselves in a mode that's a half duplex. And we'll get into the auto config stuff in a bit. But basic idea is full duplex, they can both talk at the same time over the wire. Half duplex, they have to wait for one to talk, and then the other one can, after it stops. Configuring the switch ports at a physical layer. Again, this is getting some iOS specific commands. We will have notes on this, but we will get into this in much more in depth when we start working on round 2 content. And then you have auto MDIX. And did we get into, let me make sure we didn't get into the crossover cable business here. And we did not. Okay, so we'll touch on the crossover type cable stuff here. It mentions an auto MDIX. I learned on this one. I didn't know, though, they had a cable or a setting that could handle cables like this. They have a little bit of, until recently, certain cable types, a straight through or a crossover were required when connecting devices. In my day, way back in the wood-burning computer and networking gear days, you always had both cables because you have what's called a straight through cable. And like where we've talked about in class, where you've got a patch cable that goes from a computer to the port on the wall, or when we talk about where it comes from the wall in a switch closet into one of the switches, those are straight through cables. The way the wires on the inside are mapped, they're straight through. Like in the end, they're pairs of wires that work together, but they're straight through. When you start on one side, it goes to the same equivalent portion of the cable on the other. Then there is this thing known as a crossover cable, where they reverse those things. What used to be a little bit of a hassle when you were configuring your network devices, some of the gear you had to have this crossover cable to configure it. And you would run into trouble because it, depending on what and they talk about this some, that, well, with some switches you had to have this and some routers you had to have that. And they talk about that some. And it could get a little bit aggravating because you had to go down and maybe work on a device that was down the hall on another floor, worse yet, one of your other buildings, and you've got your kit of stuff that you carry with you, and you've got maybe just a straight through cable, and you go to work on something on the network, and oh darn it, that's the such and such piece of gear, it needs a crossover cable, and you got to make a trip to go back and get the other piece of gear or whatever. At many a trip like that myself back when I was doing some switch stuff, not of course again not on the Cisco side, but on the what's now called the Avaya side, and a little bit frustrating and aggravating, and sometimes you would say, why won't this connect? Oh yeah, I need a straight through, or I need a crossover, what have you. Usually you can physically identify a crossover cable. So if we've seen mostly the yellow cables, sometimes you might see the blue ones, they're solid. When you see the ones where it's maybe a red cable and then it's got a different color just on the end, so it's a red cable with a gray end. I've seen them mix the red and yellow together, but can't say it's a perfectly a perfectly adhered to convention, but when they mix the color with the end, usually that's indicative that you've got a crossover cable. Now, sometimes people make their own crossover cables if you're handy with that kind of stuff. And of course, that's going to not have that kind of thing if it's somebody's homebrewed or you bought somewhere and it's just not using that convention. But you did have both of those. So now with that background, what they're getting into is having this auto MDIX thing enabled where you can have the device adjust to whichever kind of cable you have. So you've only got a straight through, oh darn it, I don't have my crossover, or I remember when the one crossover I carried, I remember when that thing went bad on me once and it wasted a trip. It can get you out of this and you can have the switch so it can handle whichever, and it kind of does the crossover for you if all you got a straight through. Or if you've got a straight through, or if you got a crossover, it can cross it over again, which turns it effectively into a straight through connection. So that's a really nifty thing. Was not aware that they were doing that on the gear, but when you're old and you start coming back into some of this technology, found out they've done some cool stuff to make it easier for you. Neat feature, Auto MDIX to do that. But just understanding, sometimes you need straight through, sometimes you need a crossover. It depends on the device itself, and having this capability available, potentially something you could see as a question in a scenario. Verifying the switch port configuration. So they're going to give us a couple of commands to just show us the interfaces, the startup config, the running config, flash version history, show IP, and just kind of get ready to kind of inventory that everything's healthy. You should get expected answers here. Again, some more fun content to get into when we start digging in depth on the iOS side in the packet tracer tool. Network access layer issues. Yes, sir. So you get into some of these things where you've got common problems with media. You can have bad patch cables. I've had that happen. You can have bad ports on the switch itself. You can have misconfigured things going on where you've got it set up one way and it's wrong. So they've got a few things if the interface is up. So they're showing these things you would see on your switch, or you could be running a command line and you see something's up or something's down. And they give you a couple of troubleshooting steps that tell you. So here's, if interface is up and the line protocol is down, then there's a problem. If the line protocol, so there could be an encapsulation type mismatch, the interface is there or disabled, something like that from the connection here out. If the line protocol and the interface are down, then the cable's not attached. Something's not right. If you've got a cable attached, then maybe it's a dead cable, but something's more drastically wrong with both sides. Now, if the admin side is down, maybe manually disabled, so we do the shutdown or something like that. That seems like that's the less likely scenario. Probably more likely, I think you're going to see this first one. But good to know just kind of where to start and what these things are indicating for you. So you can do a show interfaces at all, because if your line protocol is up and that sort of thing. So there's a command line way to check this out too. Collisions. So collisions, if you look for collisions, that's a counter you keep an eye on. You might see some of that no matter what, but when you see that a lot, that often is indication that you've got this half duplex thing going on and you're having some problems with something misconfigured on one end of the connection or the other, between two switches, between the PC and the switch. One of them is set one way and one is set the other, or one of them set to be what we call hard-coded, to be specifically full duplex. Maybe the other device on the other end is set to auto-negotiate and it negotiates wrong and goes into half duplex, and it's doing half duplex mode, the other one's doing full duplex. Well, of course, that's where we get collisions and you get some network implications there. Okay, troubleshooting some of the network access. So there's, again, some good stuff here to go through and look at the little problem flow that they've got. That's good stuff. So look through that some. And then SSH operations. So here's what we're doing is we've talked about the telnet and how that's usually a candidate for a disable on the service when we're on the Windows environment and doing our hardening of the Windows environment. Here they're reinforcing that notion. Old days, before we were worried about hackers and all that kind of stuff, you would use your telnet to go in, but that's something where if you can listen in on the conversation, you're sending all your commands from your PC that you're using to configure it over the network to the device, to your Cisco switch, and if someone could snoop, they could see clear text going across the network. So then we do this secure shell thing, and it goes over port 22, well understood ports. We've started to talk about ports when we've started our firewall conversations. And this just means when I have my conversation between my PC and the conversation that's having as I'm doing the administrative functions on my switch. We're doing those things so that the traffic is encrypted. So I can see what I'm doing on the PC, the device on the other end, the switch understands the commands I'm issued, but if someone were somehow in the middle of that conversation, it would be just the encrypted gobbledygook and much more difficult to turn into something that could be useful to a malicious actor. They mentioned the tool Wireshark, which we've talked about just a bit. Packet sniffing tool, grabs the packets, lets you look through stuff. Good troubleshooting tool, can be turned into a malicious actor's tool. And they're giving an example of Wireshark here, watching what's going on the network. They can click on the telnet data and notice that it's all clear text that you can read. And if you're network savvy enough, you can interpret what's going on and could use that against whomever it is that you're snooping on. You turn on the SSH, and all this is encrypted traffic and doesn't do you any good. So they're talking about how you set up the SSH content, verifying that it supports it, make sure that the device you're using actually understands it. You got to do some domain configuration. You have to generate some key pairs. Good to understand at a high level that there's some steps to getting it ready to do this SSH thing. Make sure you're in the right version, SSH1, that's crackable. Unlikely unless you're dealing with someone that's highly skilled, but best practice is definitely make sure you're on the correct version of the SSH, that you are less vulnerable. And again, some more fun stuff that we'll get into when we start doing the iOS content. Then here's verifying. We've talked about before. Here's PuTTY. So I guess our first look at the PuTTY tool that we would download. Nice tool for using to have our SSH connection. You would put PuTTY on your machine. You're going to say, I want to do SSH, not Telnet. Point it to the address or the IP address of, here they're using the IP address on port 22, of course, of the machine. So that's the IP address on port 22 to go and use this tool on your PC to talk to the switch. And then you would get a little window that would look like what we've seen if you looked at some of those early videos when you're going in and doing the commands to say enable and configure terminal and get into all the other things that we do on the switch. And you can do all that stuff from over the internet, even in a secure way. All right, good stuff. So now they're going to have a drill that we'll get into later about configuring the SSH, so we'll get some practice on it with the packet tracer tool. So we will get to that, and that'll be a lot of fun. Now, this is awesome. Some common security attacks, and really kind of kudos to Cisco to put in here these attacks and not just sweep that under the rug or whatever. They're address some things that are even kind of specific to their devices. So here's one called MAC address flooding, and this is awesome. But the idea is simple. So if you recall from the prior module in the prior video, we talked about how when a switch gets some traffic, so host A is talking to a certain port, one of the plugs, wired into one of the plugs on this switch, and it wants to send something to one of the other hosts. Well, remember the switch keeps a table of which port has which device. And here's the beginning. You've got port 1 is host A, so it sees that in its little directory of who's mapped to which port. It also has that on port 3, it can see host C. So there's where port 3, off that plug off the switch, you could follow the little wires and you come up with the PC that's host C. And recall that the way that it actually looks at that is it uses those devices that we were talking about, or the numbers we were talking about before, called a MAC address. Not IP addresses, but those MAC addresses is what it actually maps from this port to, and it's even saying MAC. It's saying A or C, but they're simplifying a lot. It's actually, of course, that much longer set of, I think it's 12 numbers. So they're simplifying here, but the idea is valid. And so recall that when you send something to the switch and it doesn't have it mapped yet, so for example, it doesn't know how to get to host B. It doesn't have the port 2 mapped to host B yet. So what does it do? It sends it out everywhere. It sends a flood is what they call it. So it sends it to every port except, of course, the sender, because that wouldn't make any sense. And so it's going to send it out port 2 and say, hey, is this for you? Hey, is this for you? And so on. So that's how the switch works by design. And then when host B answers back on port 2 and says, yes, that's mine, then it can update its little directory and say, oh, now I know it's on port 2 as well. That's where host B is. From then on, anything it gets for host B, it would know to send it out port 2. But up to that point, it does this flood thing. So the technique is to be sitting on one of these devices and to send a whole lot of requests over and over so that it has to cycle through. Basically, it causes it to, like you get too many digits, it rolls over these MAC addresses. And so you keep it doing that until it rolls over all of its addresses because it can't keep them all at once. And it does all this flooding. And so if it floods every time there's a packet, the attacker that's, let's say, on host C gets to see everything that's flooded. It gets a copy of every packet because the switch effectively never knows where to send anything specifically. So it gets to listen in on every single conversation. It's like someone's meant to whisper in someone's ear, but if they're not sure who it is, they just keep yelling it to everyone in the room. So if you can cause that situation, you can sit there and basically listen in on all the traffic. Very simple technique, very effective if you can get a hold of just any one device. So they go through that here. That is, honestly, that's slick. I was not familiar with this particular attack. So they're going to talk about port security a little bit later. So of course, if they're telling you about a hack, they're trying to fix it. But again, from a security practitioner standpoint, good to be aware of this. And when we start dealing with Cisco switches, knowing how to fix it. And if we ever get into helping folks with their environments, knowing how to audit for this and make sure that these kind of things are taken care of, because admins get really busy and sometimes they're not super knowledgeable and they can leave some of this stuff open. You would be shocked at how much of this kind of thing isn't accounted for in important networks, in healthcares and insurance and financials and so forth, that leave things like this open. So good to be aware of this kind of stuff, how to find it, how to fix it, and be good about helping others get this stuff tidied up and protect their data and their property and well-being. Now here's another one called the DHCP spoof. So kind of doing the same thing. DHCP, of course, is the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It's basically where a device doesn't have an IP address yet. So a computer comes up, I don't have an IP address. I wasn't configured with one specifically. I think we talked about that in the last video where you can actually code in what IP address it gets. Of course, too many machines on a network, that becomes a cumbersome thing to track and take care of. Very error prone to do as a manual process. So you set up what's called a DHCP server like this one is, and it's got a whole table of numbers that it hands out, and it tracks who's got which number. It knows to scratch that one off the list of available numbers. It has processes for checking to say, hey, you've had that number for 3 whole days. Do you really need it? The PC knows how to respond, yes, I'd like to renew it for another 3 days. It says fine, and so on. Or if it realizes, hey, this machine isn't answering when I ask if it still needs that number, comes a point where it says, okay, you're no longer authorized to use that number, puts it back in the pool, and this device, if maybe it had been down or for whatever reason when it comes back up, it's got to start the request process again. All that stuff can happen behind the scenes, and it works just fine, and it's great stuff in a network environment. But this is where they flood it with DHCP requests, and it uses up all of the IP addresses that it has, and it hands out. And maybe you've got a network with 50 devices, and you've set it up for 64 or 128 available IP addresses, kind of scaling what you make your network available for. Remember all our subnetting stuff. But then if you keep asking and faking it out like you're a whole bunch of different hosts asking for IP addresses, it hands all the numbers out, it runs out of them, and then if you can't hand any more out, then when the legit PCs come in trying to renew their numbers, they can't. There's no numbers available. So it can cause a denial of service attack. It's not actually something where you listen in on the where you would actually listen in on the traffic, but you could create this denial of service, which would give you sort of like in the action movie when they say, okay, I'll go do this explosion to cause a distraction. That pulls all of the security guards off to that part of the building, or pulls all the cops to that part of the town. And then the bad guys go in through some other part, and then they do their thing because the security resources are off elsewhere. That's a lot of time you would do as a predecessor attack to cause something like this. Then you go in while everybody's not paying attention and they're not watching the logs and so on, and you use it as a preceding attack to go in and then do something else. Okay, something specific to Cisco Discovery Protocol, and good stuff here. You could have this turn on. You've got some telnet attacks, and you've got brute force password attacks, where you sit there and you just try to, like, just kind of like we've talked about in the Windows environment, keep running dictionary attacks or variation on dictionary attacks to get break in by just shooting every single possible password you could. So you can turn some of these features on your Cisco device, and it'll know, hey, wait, I'm not gonna listen to that attack, telnet DOS attack. So it's got some things where you can turn some features on, limit some of these Cisco specific things that could happen, and protect your network by turning these features on. Again, read through it, get the idea. It's probably stuff you wouldn't, not things to just memorize, but be aware it's out there. And then when you get into the environment, you know to check, to configure it if you're the network admin, or when we get to try to help others with their environment, we can help them do some checks and make sure they've got the right set of things configured. So good awareness on that exposure and capability for Mitigate. Okay, this drill here, okay, it's working now. When I was going through this lesson before, wasn't working so great. So we've got this where it says just a nice matching. I would strongly recommend doing this one until you can get it figured out. So allows an attacker to configure DHCP server. So we would take something like DHCP spoofing, check that. It says that's right. The incorrect because we haven't done all the answers. So you got the first one. So go through there, see if you've got that. That's a good learning check right there on the prior material. Best practices. This right here is the best slide, I think, so far of the entire Cisco thing. This is one page of just good security practices, irrespective of Cisco and networking and all that. So we've got developing a written security policy for the organization. So this is getting away from hardening servers and tightening up network environments and that kind of stuff. But this is so very true. Written security policy. This gets into things where the biggest security problem on any network is those knuckleheads sitting in the chair creating problems, clicking on emails they shouldn't. So you develop these security policies that say you shall not do this and you shall not do that, and if you can get your HR team to help you with making sure that these things are followed. So you have to have security policies that say this is how we're going to do things, we're going to do them in a secure way. There can be repercussions if an employee doesn't behave in a way that they should. They're creating risk for the environment of the organization, and you need to have ways to handle some of those things. And then you get into these arm wrestling matches over, well, are we going to let users have local admin on their PCs? The correct answer says, no, we're not going to do that. If you have a written policy that this is how we're going to roll and your executive sponsorship of your organization understands and agrees with that, it makes it a lot simpler to deal with some of these things where you get into these battles between security best practices versus user ease and that sort of thing. So very, very important. A little beyond the scope of what we've done so far, but good to start thinking about some of these kind of aspects as well. Shutting down unused services and ports. So this is kind of like the idea of turning off the services that were remote connectivity services like we had on the Windows, or turning off the SMB stuff that was in the Linux. Same idea within the Cisco is if a port's not being used, don't leave it as something that it can try to connect in. Strong passwords, change them often. Notice thus far we haven't seen anything in Cisco about complexity of passwords or minimum length or have to forced to be changed every 30 days. So you get into things where you need to, where the environment may not force you with a technical control, but you need to have some sort of way to go through and change these passwords. You'll see things where the network engineering team has a team member leave, and even if it's a trusted person, or maybe they left on not the best terms, and they don't go back and reset some of this kind of stuff, some major outages and problems have been happening where people didn't clean up after themselves when an engineer got laid off or fired and it wasn't a great departure. And they didn't protect themselves because they didn't account for everything that needed to be accounted for here. So very wise bullet point there. Controlling physical access. So there is this axiom in security that if you got physical access to a gizmo, you own the gizmo. There are ways, usually, if you can physically get your hands on it, it's really hard to keep someone locked out. So just having physical control with locks, you've got things where the racks where the devices sit have locks on the doors. Then you want your rooms are to have physical locks on them. Your building needs to be controlled. So physical access to devices to make sure only the folks that really need to be messing with that stuff can. And this whole thing of like servers under desks and those kind of days, that sort of thing needs to be over with, because again, physical access to your network gear, to your servers, those kind of things. Can't have that unless it's need to know type basis. Avoiding insecure HTTP. We all pretty much know some of that, especially login. So if you're logging onto your bank or something that's got some sensitive data and it doesn't have the HTTPS and your little lock in the browser, clearly something needs to be revisited. Making sure your backups are good. That's probably one of the biggest things that's getting missed with all of the ransomware stuff. If you have good backups, good offline backups, you're in decent shape. You lose one day of work, you restore your offline backups because the encryption software couldn't get to it, and you would be fine. But a lot of folks, if they had had better backup procedures, could have avoided a lot of the problems that they've had with the ransomware attacks. Okay, here we are talking about the employees. Educate them about social engineering. We do that a lot at work where we go in, and I actually did that with a new employee just today. Is part of the orientation process. Be careful about what you click on. You see attachments and you see links in there. Think twice about that. And if you're not sure, absolutely do not click on it. Anytime you see an outside of the organization originating email, think, wait a minute, am I sure that this is what it appears to be? Delegating policies and that kind of stuff. So this is all extremely important because it's really hard. It's really hard to secure the human device. Encrypting, password protecting sensitive data. Yeah, great ideas there. Implementing security hardware and software such as firewalls and a litany of other things. Making sure software is up to date. Installing security patches weekly, daily, what have you. Of course, Microsoft we know is a monthly thing. The Linux the Ubuntu we can configure to do daily. But then you tend to you can forget about other stuff. Cisco comes out with security patches for their gear. The Adobe stuff, there's all kinds of devices that are floating around your network that can become the vector for an attack. So you think you've got, just because you've got your Windows patched up, there are other vectors that can be exposed, especially anything that's got a web interface on it. You can see badging systems that have a device that's got a web interface. Those things, HVAC systems are notorious for being really old and out of date and not easily secured. Those can be problems. So thinking about your whole environment, very important. So they mentioned software, and that's truly important for everything that's on your network. And like they mentioned, these are only a starting point for security management. So it's really important, very good stuff. Really good start to overall security practice in an organization. Really, really good. A good slide there. Tools and testing. So we're getting a little bit into some of the security audit side of it, which I'm really glad for our audience here. So you're talking about network security. Firewalls, of course, they've got rules that say what kind of traffic is allowed in or out on what ports, between which devices. Intrusion prevention systems, there's IPS prevention, there's IDS, intrusion detection. Everyone's trying to go where they've got intrusion prevention instead of detecting there might be something nefarious going on in your network and then alerting someone to take care of it. Now we're doing prevention where it sees something that seems like it's anomalous traffic and let's turn it off or prevent it, in addition to sending an alert to the service or to the administrative team. Operating systems, well, we've got to have that, so making sure those are secure and configured and hardened correctly. Programming, and then of course our networking protocols, the TCP/IP, that's the language of networking. Network security audit. So there's a couple of ways you can look at this. Just going through your own environment, just checking, hey, have I done everything that I can? Have I got everything patched up like it should be? Was there something I did when I installed a piece of gear and I was a little bit hasty and I need to go back and make sure? That's important. When you get into organizations of any size, or especially if you host other people's data, you can get into third-party audits where you pay someone to come in and check things out and give you, which that can be very valuable. Sometimes, like in financial sector, that can be mandatory, where there's regulators that say you have to have a third party do this for you. And then you have to give that report to regulators and you get audited and so forth. And it's also just good though. So having a second pair of eyes, having people that are seasoned veterans in security practices and can go through and see some stuff you might not, or look at things differently, or maybe aren't. Sometimes you get to where the network administrators, they do things that are maybe a little bit easier. They think, oh, that's not a big deal, that'll be okay. You get someone that comes from outside, they're not as worried about how hard it is, or does it create some administrative time commitment or overhead, or makes things a little bit harder. Or they're not worried if the users care if it makes it harder or not. They can come in from the outside and say, hey, you guys need to fix this, or at least give some recommendation, so that if you choose not to do something, someone in management says, okay, I'm going to accept the fact that we're not going to fix this, and I'm going to accept that risk. Kind of also forces some of that stuff out in the open. So getting the third party review can be very useful too, in addition to just the team going through and trying to be as diligent in implementing best practices as they can. Disabling unused ports, so here they're going through some of that. We've talked about that a little bit, but just if it's not in use, turn it off. Reduce that attack vector. DHCP snooping, allowing which ports are even allowed to handle a DHCP request. Don't know how many folks actually take it this far. It's a great idea, though. Sometimes it becomes like keeping track of which ports, and then, oh, darn it, create a troubleshooting issue for yourself. So best practice, a bit of a cost versus risk thing on whether or not it's worth doing, but definitely a good thing to do to secure yourself. And then here's port security. This one's not done probably like it should be. Very important. You can really save yourself a lot of risk if you go in and secure it down to how many or which MAC addresses, essentially saying which actual computers, which physical computers are allowed to attach to which port. Create some administrative overhead. Whoever's going to be managing this stuff, this is some extra work. But you also make it harder so that someone's got some random laptop that sneaks in your building and they plug a random laptop into an open port on the wall. The MAC address associated with the network card and laptop, that's not on my list. I'm not going to let you in. And so you can make it a lot harder for a malicious actor, even a good one that's local in your building or in your network, make it a lot harder to get a solid presence inside the network and start causing trouble. And there will be some lab stuff to talk about it. Violation mode, so this is basically if it sees an alert, what's it do? Does it actually go as far as to shut down or do something a little less drastic? So, but this is just what do you want it to do if it senses a violation when you've turned on this security mode. Okay, so now we walk through how to do port security. Some of this stuff I don't know. I think understanding the stuff, being aware of it, but going through those steps, we'll see. Not sure if that would be a great candidate for the questions though on the Cyber Patriot. Verifying port security. So again, just making sure that double check gives you a way to double check and make sure your behavior is as you wanted it to. Ports in an error disabled state. Again, this is more on the troubleshooting side of things. Not sure what the Cyber Patriot security part would be. When you go in, you got some ports down. Network time protocol. This can be important from a troubleshooting standpoint because there is a type of an attack called a replay attack where you record a session from a device where you saw network traffic, you use something like your Wireshark, you record that, then you take it and just do the same thing from your computer. And even though you don't know like what someone typed in for a password or how they did something, but you've got a capture of what the network said, maybe even an encrypted version of it, and even though you don't know what it says, you think that's pretty sure how they got into a system, and you take that traffic and you simulate that traffic from your computer to the switch or the server, whatever it is you're trying to log on to. And that can be a valid technique. So what becomes important is making sure that the way that time is configured, the way that these devices see their time, like my PC down here saying it's 7:05, making sure that those have a reliable time source that they pull from. And then you have things set up that say, once something rolls through within this amount of time, it's not allowed to do that set of stuff anymore. So if your time is off, or inconsistent, you can have these troubleshooting errors because you've got things set up to prevent, you've got time constraints set up to prevent these relay attacks. So they're going through how you configure your switch to point somewhere upstream, like I think they show a couple of well-known ones. There's like a Navy site that's got some time that's sort of like official time for a lot of things in the world, Navy.mil. There's one called, there's like a tick and a talk that you'll see out there, but just finding a reliable source over the internet. Or sometimes what you'll do is you'll have one thing on your network and it's pointed to that reliable source on the internet, like one of those Navy sites, and then everything else on the network points to that one, so that you don't have everybody going across the network to get their time, but it does keep it consistent. So you got the one on the network that points upstream, and then everybody else syncs against it. And that often is a manageable way to keep all the time on sync in your network. And then configuring the port security on a packet tracer activity, that'll be fun. Same thing, some more packet tracer stuff. That'll be some fun stuff when we get into it. And switch features in the lab, and then the switch trio thing, which I didn't really go into a lot of detail, and then the skills integration challenge. So this is kind of like the wrap-up skill thing, which we'll work on after our first round of competition, and I think that gets us to the summary. All right, so it's going to talk about post. So review, post bootloader, loads up the iOS, goes into the startup config file. We talked about port security some. They talk about the full and half duplex, use SSH. They didn't talk about the policy side, I don't think. I wish they would. And oh, there we go. Yeah, there we go. There's some of the policy stuff. Don't use right here. Best practices, written security policy, and all those kind of things, which again, since they repeat it, that's probably more pertinent. And a good, again, we either want to bookmark these or have these handy or what have you. So really good module to go through, not that long, pretty reachable, not hyper technical. So a good one to have handy, and lots of good content. If I was Cyber Patriot, I would be hitting this one probably as hard as any of the Cisco content that we've had so far. So this one's important. We got one more for this round, and we'll have that shortly. So talk to you soon, and thanks for